before the last sword fell on the battlefield, before the ravens found the bodies and the smoke thinned into a colorless sky. She was already there, watching, choosing, moving through the carnage with a calm that no living soldier could possess. You would not see her unless she wished it, and if she did, it was already too late. She was a Valkyrie. The word itself tells you everything and nothing all at once. It comes to us from Old Norse, Valkyrja, and it means, with a simplicity that is almost beautiful, chooser of the slain. Not killer, not warrior, chooser. There is a deliberateness in that name, an authority that sets the Valkyries apart from every other figure in the vast, storm-colored tapestry of Norse mythology. They did not merely witness war, they decided its meaning. For centuries, long before the Viking Age burned bright across northern Europe, long before the longships cut into foreign rivers and the world learned to fear the sight of a dragon prow, the Norse people lived under a sky they believed was watched, not by distant, indifferent gods, but by women, magnificent, armored, celestial women, riding horses across the arc of heaven, their spears catching light that mortals below might briefly mistake for the aurora. The Norse had a name for that cold fire in the sky too, Norðurljós, the Northern Lights. And there are those scholars who believe that on certain winter nights, when the sky trembled green and violet above the frozen fields, the Old Norse looked up and saw exactly what they expected to see: the shimmer of a Valkyrie's armor as she rode toward Valhalla with her chosen dead. It is a thought worth sitting with for a moment. In appearance, the Valkyries were not the feathered, wispy spirits of later romantic imagination. The earliest Norse sources describe something far more formidable. They wore helmets, often described as gleaming, almost blindingly bright, and carried long spears, the kind that could be felt in a battlefield long after the hand that threw them had gone cold. Their shields were round and iron-bossed. Their horses were swift beyond reason, capable of riding not only across the earth, but through the air and over the sea, their hooves barely disturbing the surface of dark water. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Some sources describe flames dancing from their horses' manes. Others note that when a Valkyrie raised her spear, a strange light played along the shaft, what the skalds called Valkyrijos, the Valkyrie's light, and that soldiers on the field sometimes mistook it for an omen of victory, when in fact it was something closer to a verdict. There were many of them. The sources give us anywhere from 9 to 13, though the exact number seems to shift with the telling, as myths are inclined to do. Among the most celebrated are Brynhildr, whose story would spiral into one of the most tragic love cycles the medieval world would ever produce. Grendel, whose name carries the shadow weight of enchantment. Sigrun, the battle rune herself. Ildra, whose very name simply means battle. And Skuld, who was something stranger still, not merely a Valkyrie, but also counted among the Norns, those ancient weavers of fate who sat at the roots of Yggdrasil and measured out the thread of every life. To be chosen by a skald was to be touched by something older than war itself. Their realm of power was staggering in its scope. They operated at the precise intersection of the mortal and the divine, not fully of this world, not fully of Asgard, but moving fluidly between them, carrying out the will of Odin, the All-Father, who presided over death in war, the way other gods might preside over the sea or the harvest. It was Odin who needed the warriors, not for his own glory exactly, but for something far more urgent. For Ragnarok, the end of all things, the final battle at the edge of time, when the gods themselves would fall and the world would be remade. Odin was preparing. Every great warrior who died in battle was a soldier conscripted into that last cosmic fight. and the Valkyries were his recruiters. They moved through the chaos of battle with what the skalds described as a kind of terrible serenity. They did not fight, or rather, they did not need to. Their power was not the power of the sword arm. It was the power of recognition. They looked at the dying and the already dead, and they knew, the way a conductor might know which note to lift from an orchestra, which soul was destined for Valhalla, and which would pass below to Hell's grey hall. That knowledge was their weapon, and it was absolute. In the great meat hall of Valhalla itself, the Valkyries served a gentler function, bringing drink to the Einherjar, the honored dead who feasted and fought endlessly in preparation for Ragnarok. But do not mistake that domestic image for the whole of who they were. It was a fraction. The serving of mead to heroes was merely the peaceful end of a journey that began in fire and iron, and the sound of 10,000 men crying out at once across a muddy field at the edge of the world. What follows is their story, told slowly, as it deserves to be. We will move through it the way the Valkyries themselves moved, without haste, with purpose, choosing carefully what to carry forward and what to leave behind. We will meet them individually, trace their legends through the oldest texts that survive, and consider what it meant, what it truly meant, for an entire civilization to look up at a winter sky and imagine it filled not with emptiness, but with riders. Find a comfortable place. There is no hurry here. There never was, for those who deal in eternity. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over very old things. You feel it in museums, standing before objects that have survived 1,000 years of being handled, lost, rediscovered, copied, translated, and argued over by people who dedicated their entire lives to understanding them. It is not an empty silence. It is the silence of enormous weight, the weight of everything that had to survive against remarkable odds for you to be standing there looking at it at all. That is the silence that surrounds the texts in which the Valkyries live. The oldest and richest of them is a collection known as the Poetic Edda, a manuscript that exists today because a single Icelandic bishop, Brynjolfur Sveinsson, acquired it in 1643 and recognized it for what it was, something irreplaceable. The manuscript itself dates to around 1270, though the poems inside it are far older, drawn from an oral tradition that stretches back centuries before anyone thought to write them down. We call it the Codex Regius now, the King's Book, because Brynjolfur eventually sent it to the King of Denmark as a gift, and it sat in the Royal Library in Copenhagen for nearly 300 years before Iceland finally brought it home in 1971, transported by naval frigate, received on the docks of Reykjavik by a crowd that had waited generations for its return. That is how much these words matter to the people who carry them. Within the Poetic Edda, the Valkyries appear in ways that range from brief and electric to devastatingly extended. In the Völuspá, the prophecy of the CRS, arguably the single most important poem in all of Norse literature, they are named in passing, catalogued with a brisk, almost administrative certainty that somehow makes them more ominous, not less. The seeress lists them as she lists the roots of the world tree and the names of the dwarves and the great events of time, matter of fact, inevitable, already decided. Skuld carried a shield, the poem tells us. Skogul rode with her, and Gondel and Gerskogul. The names tumble forward, like the sound of hooves on stone. And the listener, the original listener, seated in a hall lit by firelight, not reading but hearing, would have recognized each one, felt the particular freight each name carried. That is the nature of oral literature. It does not explain itself. It assumes you already know and speaks to you across that shared knowledge, like a hand reaching across a table. The second great source is the prose Edda, written in Iceland in the early 13th century by a man named Snorri Sturluson, a historian, politician, and poet who understood, with remarkable clarity, that the old stories were slipping away as Christianity reshaped Scandinavian culture, and who set about preserving them in a form precise enough to be useful to future poets and scholars. Snorri is one of the most consequential writers of the medieval period, and he is also one of the most complicated, because he was a Christian writing about the pagan past, which meant he was always doing two things at once: preserving and interpreting, illuminating and occasionally, perhaps inevitably, reshaping. Reading Snorri is like looking at a photograph taken through old glass. The image is vivid and real and invaluable, but you are always aware of the medium standing between you and the original light. In the Prose Edda, Snorri gives us our most organized portrait of the Valkyries as a group. He describes them in Odin's service, names them, links them to specific roles in the cosmic machinery of Valhalla and the battlefield. He is the one who gives us the clearest statement of their dual nature, that they are both the agents of death on the field and the servers of mead in the hall. And in doing so, he captures something the later romanticized versions of the myth would tend to lose: the idea that power and service were not opposites in the Norse world. To serve the greatest of the dead in the grandest hall in all the 9 worlds was not diminishment. It was its own form of dominion. Beyond the Eddas, the Valkyries breathe inside the skaldic poetry, a form of verse so technically demanding that mastering it was considered a kind of genius. Skaldic poets composed in strict meters with elaborate systems of internal rhyme and kennings, those compressed, imagistic substitutions that are one of the great pleasures and occasional torments of Old Norse literature. A sword was not a sword, it was a wound snake or a bloodworm. The sea was the whale road, and a Valkyrie. A Valkyrie might be called a raven feeder, or a screamer of the spear clash, or simply, with devastating economy, a victory woman. These kennings were not decoration. They were the actual meaning, compressed into a harder, sharper form. When a skaldic poet called a Valkyrie a raven feeder, he was reminding his audience that her presence on a battlefield meant bodies, and bodies meant ravens, and ravens were Odin's birds, and Odin's birds meant the Allfather himself was watching, which meant this particular battle was not ordinary. It mattered cosmically. The kenning did all of that in 2 words. It is worth pausing on the ravens for a moment, because they connect the Valkyries to something even older than the texts that contain them. Odin kept 2 ravens, Haugin and Munin, thought and memory, who flew out each morning across the 9 worlds and returned each evening to whisper everything they had seen into his ears. The Valkyries and the ravens were both his instruments of observation on the battlefield, and there is a persistent scholarly argument that the Valkyries themselves may have originally had a closer connection to ravens than the surviving texts make fully explicit. Certain early poems describe Valkyries in terms that blur the line between woman and bird: swooping, dark, winged, gathering over the fallen. Some researchers trace them back to an older Germanic concept of battle spirits, semi-divine women who were as much carrion creatures as choosers. Their presence on the field announced not by hoofbeats, but by the dry, particular sound of large wings settling. It is an unsettling image. It is also, perhaps, the truest one. There is one more source that deserves its own moment here, because it sits slightly apart from the others in its form and its feeling. The Darathaljoth, the Song of the Spear, is a poem preserved within the Engjal saga, one of the great Icelandic family sagas of the 13th century. The saga tells us that on the morning of the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, a real battle, fought in Ireland, in which the High King Brian Boru died. A man in Caithness, on the northern tip of Scotland, looked through a window and saw 12 women on horseback ride toward a building and disappear inside. He crept to the wall and looked through a gap in the stones, and what he saw was the 12 women at a loom. But the loom was terrible. The warp was strung with human intestines. The weights were human heads. The shuttle was a sword. And as they wove, they sang, And what they sang was the Daradhal Yoth, a poem about choosing the dead at Clontarf, about deciding who would live and who would fall and who would be carried off to Valhalla before the sun set over Ireland. When they finished weaving, they tore the cloth apart, each taking her own piece, and rode away, 6 to the south, 6 to the north. And the man who had watched understood that he had seen something he was not meant to see, and that the battle far away had already been decided. The saga presents this as a thing that actually happened, not a legend, not a myth, but an event, a reported event, from a specific morning, in a specific place, connected to a specific historical battle. This is the most important thing to understand about the Valkyries. As they exist in the old sources, they were not confined to the deep mythological past, to the timeless world of Odin and Yggdrasil, and the first shaping of the 9 worlds. They were present. They were ongoing. In the Norse and Germanic imagination, every large battle, every field where the stakes were high enough, where the dead were significant enough, potentially hosted them. The choice of the slain was not something that had happened once at the beginning of time. It was happening still. Every generation that told these stories told them as people who believed the weavers were still at their loom. In the next segment, we will leave the texts behind and step onto the battlefield itself, into the specific, extraordinary legends of individual Valkyries, the stories where they love and suffer and disobey, and become something the cold administrative catalogue of names could never fully prepare you for. Because the Valkyries, it turns out, were not only choosers of the slain, some of them had their own grief to carry. There is a temptation, when studying mythological figures, to keep them at a comfortable distance, to treat them as symbols, as archetypes, as the raw material of cultural analysis. It is a legitimate approach. It is also, ultimately, an incomplete one. Because the stories the Norse told about their Valkyries are not only cosmological, they are not only about the machinery of war and the logistics of paradise. They are, at their most vivid and most enduring, stories about individual women, specific, named, complicated women, who felt things with an intensity that makes them impossible to hold at arm's length. The moment you meet Brynhilde, you understand this immediately. She is the most famous of the Valkyries, and her story is one of the most sweeping tragedies in all of medieval literature. It begins, as so many Norse stories do, with an act of defiance. Odin had decreed that a particular king, Hjálm Gunnar, old and favored by the Allfather, should win a certain battle. Brynhilde disagreed. She looked at the opposing warrior, a young man named Agnar, and she chose him instead. She gave Hjálm Gunnar to the slain, and gave Agnar the victory that was not hers to give. And in doing so, she stepped outside the boundaries of the role she had been assigned, with a clarity and a deliberateness that left no room for misunderstanding. She knew exactly what she was doing. Odin's response was measured in the way that divine punishment is always measured, disproportionate to any ordinary human sense of justice, perfectly proportionate to the logic of the world it operates within. He stripped her of her Valkyrie status. He placed her in an enchanted sleep on a hill called Hindafjall, surrounded by a wall of fire that no ordinary man could cross, and he decreed that she would remain there until a man without fear came to wake her. It is a punishment that carries within it its own strange mercy. The fire ensures that whoever reaches her will be extraordinary. Odin, even in his anger, could not quite bring himself to give Brynhilde to someone unworthy. He simply made her wait. The man who came, eventually, was Sigurd, in the more familiar Germanic form, the greatest hero of the Norse world, slayer of the dragon Fafnir, bearer of the sword Gram, a figure so central to the mythological tradition that his story spread across the entire Germanic world, surfacing in the German Nibelungenlied, echoing faintly in Tolkien, burning quietly at the center of Wagner's Ring cycle. Sigurd rode through the fire without hesitation because he was constitutionally incapable of fear, cut away Brynhilde's armor with his sword, because it had been fitted so tightly it had become like a second skin. And when she woke, the two of them sat together on that hilltop and understood, in the immediate, wordless way of people who have found their equal, that something irreversible had just happened. They pledged themselves to each other. They exchanged oaths. And then the world intervened, as it tends to do in Norse literature, where fate is not a background condition but an active, grinding force that presses down on even the most exceptional lives. Sigurd left. Through a combination of a magic potion and the particular cruelties of court politics, he forgot Brynhilde entirely and married another woman, Brynhilde, whose memory was perfect and whose love had not diminished by a single degree, married a king named Gunnar, a good man, but not the right one, and the two of them moved through their separate lives on a collision course that the audience of any Norse hall would have recognized immediately, because this is what Norse tragedy does. It shows you the catastrophe from a long way off, and then walks you toward it slowly, step by terrible step, so that you feel every inch of the distance. The collision, when it comes, is over something almost absurdly small. A quarrel between two queens about whose husband's honor takes precedence, which escalates into a revelation, which leads to Brynhilde learning the full shape of what has been done to her, and to her love, and to the oath that should have made her Sigurd's wife. Her grief transforms immediately into something colder. She engineers Sigurd's death. And when he dies, when the man she never stopped loving is killed, she cannot survive it. She mounts his funeral pyre. She burns with him. The last image the poems give us of Brynhilde is of smoke rising from a pyre, and beneath that smoke, the two of them together at last, wrapped in a single flame. It is not a comfortable story. It was never meant to be. Brynhilde is the most famous, but she is not the only Valkyrie whose story cuts this deep. Sigrun, whose name means victory rune, as though her entire identity were compressed into a purpose, lived a story that rhymes with Brynhilde's in its central architecture, but arrives at an ending that is somehow even stranger and more haunting. Sigrun loved a hero named Helgi Hundingsbane, and she loved him with the full, unambiguous force of a woman who had decided. She had been promised to another man, Kjörthbrodra, a king she did not choose and did not want. And she sought Helgi out and asked him, with a directness that the poem presents without any self-consciousness, to fight for her, not to rescue her in the passive sense, to make a choice that matched her own. Helgi did, because he was the kind of man who could, and they found their way to each other through a battle that was as much about desire as it was about politics. They had very little time together. Helgi was killed, as Norse heroes almost always are, because the mythology has a profound suspicion of lasting happiness, and Sigrun's grief became a vigil. Her handmaiden saw Helgi riding toward his burial mound with a company of warriors, and Sigrun was told, and she went to the mound, and Helgi was there, not a ghost in the thin, regretful sense. There, present, armored, himself. The Norse conception of the dead who remained near their burial mounds was far more substantial than the classical or Christian notion of spirits. Helgi was there, the way a man is there, and they spent the night together, and in the morning he rode away, and he did not come back again. Sigrun waited. She set up the watch every night for a long time. He did not return. The poem ends there, with the waiting. It offers no resolution, no comfort, no explanation, just a woman at the entrance of a burial mound, watching the road. Not all Valkyrie legends are tragedies, though the Norse imagination did seem particularly drawn to grief as a lens for understanding power. There are Valkyries in the sources who appear briefly and magnificently and without personal catastrophe, figures who seem to exist purely in the register of the sublime. Gundul is one of these. Her name is connected to the word for wand or enchantment, and she appears in the sources, as the Valkyrie perhaps most associated with the raw, unmediated exercise of the choosing itself. In the Hakonarmal, a skaldic poem composed in honor of the Norwegian king Hakon the Good, who died in battle in 961, Gundel and another Valkyrie named Skirgul appear to oversee Hakon's death, but the poem does something remarkable with this moment. Rather than framing Hakon's death as loss, it frames it as recognition. Gundel leans on her spear and watches the dying king, and the poem records her words as essentially a statement of appreciation. Here is a man of sufficient quality. Here is someone worth choosing. Hakon himself, in the poem, does not rail against his death. He asks only that he be allowed to keep his armor, since a warrior should arrive in Valhalla as he left the earth. It is one of the most dignified death scenes in Norse literature, and Gundel is at the center of it, not as an agent of loss, but as a kind of ultimate acknowledgement. She is the measure of a life's worth, rendered in the form of a woman with a spear and the cold, clear eyes of someone who has seen every kind of courage and knows immediately how to rank it. There is something almost comforting in that, if you are willing to sit with it. The idea that, at the end, what comes for you is not random, that it looks at you and sees you fully and makes a judgment that means something, that the last thing that happens to you is that you are finally truly known. The Valkyries and their individual legends are not simply agents of Odin's will. They are that, yes, but they are also women who loved badly and well, and sometimes both at once. Women who disobeyed the most powerful being in the 9 worlds because they had their own sense of justice. Women who waited at burial mounds and burned on funeral pyres and leaned on spears over dying kings with something in their expression that the Skalds tried to name and never quite could. In the next segment, we turn outward, away from the individual and toward the world these figures shaped. The way the Valkyrie tradition spread beyond Scandinavia, took root in other soils, transformed under other hands, and ultimately found its way, altered almost beyond recognition, and yet somehow still itself, into the modern imagination. They have been traveling a very long time. Ideas, like rivers, do not stay where they begin. They move. They find channels through the landscape of human culture, carrying sediment from their origins while picking up new material along the way, depositing something different at every bend from what they carried of the source. By the time a river reaches the sea, it has become something the mountain spring that fed it would not recognize. And yet the water is the same water. The source is still there, somewhere upstream, if you are willing to trace it back. The Valkyries have been traveling for a very long time, and tracing their journey from the frozen fields of pre-Viking Scandinavia, outward across Europe, and eventually across centuries into the modern world, is one of the more quietly astonishing exercises that mythology offers, because at every stage of that journey, something essential survived the translation. Something in the image of the armored woman who moves through war with a purpose beyond the war itself, refused to be entirely lost, no matter how many times the story changed hands. The first leg of the journey is the oldest, and it takes us not forward in time but backward, into the broader Germanic world from which the specifically Norse mythology eventually crystallized. The Valkyries did not spring fully formed from Scandinavian soil. Their roots are tangled with a much wider complex of belief that spread across the Germanic-speaking peoples of Northern Europe. The Angles, the Saxons, the Franks, the Goths. Long before those peoples separated into the distinct cultures history would eventually name them. Scholars of comparative mythology have identified cognate figures in early Anglo-Saxon tradition, spirit women associated with battle, with the dead, with a kind of supernatural female power that hovered at the edge of conflict. The Old English word Valkyrji, from which the Norse Valkyrja is a close cousin, appears in Anglo-Saxon texts, usually as a gloss for classical figures like the Furies or Bellona, the Roman goddess of war. The translators who used it understood that their audience would recognize what was meant, that the concept of a supernatural female figure with dominion over battle death was sufficiently embedded in Germanic consciousness that it could serve as a ready translation for foreign ideas. This is significant. It tells us that the Valkyrie, or something very like her, was not a specifically Norse invention. She was a pan-Germanic inheritance, something these northern peoples carried with them through their migrations across the early medieval world. And she was old enough by the time the written sources appeared that no one bothered to explain where she had come from. She was simply part of what the world was understood to contain. The migration of the Germanic peoples westward and southward brought traces of this tradition into contact with Roman, Celtic, and eventually Christian culture, and in each of those encounters something interesting happened. The image bent. It accommodated. It found local equivalents and grafted itself onto them, producing figures that are not quite Valkyries but carry unmistakable traces of the same root system. The Irish Morrigan, that triple goddess of war and fate and sovereignty who appeared on battlefields in the form of a crow, who hovered over dying heroes and sometimes intervened in conflicts in ways that were as much personal as cosmic, is not the same figure as a Norse Valkyrie. But the family resemblance is close enough to be worth noting. Both are supernatural women. Both are associated with the crow or raven. Both move through the dead with a kind of authority that male warriors cannot claim. Both are connected to fate in ways that exceed simple prophecy and approach something more active, more choosing, whether this represents a shared Proto-Indo-European inheritance, a contact phenomenon between neighboring cultures, or simply the independent arrival of similar ideas in similar conditions. Scholars continue to debate, with the particular relish that genuinely open questions tend to inspire. But the resemblance is there, patient and suggestive, waiting to be looked at. The Viking Age, roughly the late 8th through the late 11th centuries, sent the Norse tradition itself outward across extraordinary distances. Norse settlers reached Iceland, Greenland, and the coast of North America. Norse traders and raiders pushed deep into what is now Russia, following the great river systems south toward Constantinople and the Caspian Sea, establishing the trade routes that would eventually make the city of Kiev one of the most important in the medieval world. Norse mercenaries served in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine emperors, those formidable axe-bearing soldiers who protected the throne in Constantinople and left runic inscriptions on the marble railings of the Hagia Sophia, carvings that are still there today, quiet graffiti from men who had traveled further than almost anyone else alive in their century. Wherever the Norse went, they carried their stories. And while we cannot trace precisely how the Valkyrie legend spread through oral contact, that kind of transmission leaves no documents. We can see its effects in the way the image appears and reappears in unexpected places, slightly altered, wearing different clothes but carrying the same essential posture. In England, which had its own deep Germanic inheritance, and then received a fresh infusion of Norse culture through the Danelaw, those northern and eastern territories that came under Scandinavian control in the 9th century. The image of the supernatural battle-woman was particularly persistent. When the Normans arrived in 1066, they brought with them a French-speaking aristocratic culture that was itself derived from Norse settlers who had taken root in what is now Normandy 2 centuries earlier. The Normans were, in a real sense, Vikings who had learned to speak French. And while the Valkyrie as a named figure does not survive in Norman tradition, the underlying pattern, the female figure with power over battle fate, the woman who stands at the edge of the military world and presides over it in ways no soldier can, surfaces repeatedly in medieval French and English Romance literature, usually wearing the costume of a fairy queen or an enchantress, stripped of her armor but not of her authority. Morgan Le Fay, in the Arthurian tradition, is perhaps the most famous example of this persistence. A woman who takes the dying Arthur from the battlefield to carry him somewhere beyond death, somewhere restorative, somewhere the sword wounds of the world cannot follow. She is not a Valkyrie, but she is doing what a Valkyrie does, and the structural echo is audible across 8 centuries of literary distance. Then came the Renaissance, and the long, strange centuries in which the Norse tradition slipped almost entirely from European consciousness, buried under the accumulated weight of classical education, Christian theology, and a cultural turn toward Mediterranean antiquity as the model of all that was worthy in the human past. The Valkyries did not disappear during these centuries. They survived in manuscripts, in Icelandic memory, in the quiet persistence of a small island's literary culture. But they were not widely known. They were not part of the conversation. What brought them back was Romanticism. The late 18th and early 19th centuries saw an eruption of interest in Northern European antiquity that was partly scholarly, partly nationalist, and partly something harder to name. A hunger, perhaps, felt across a Europe that had just lived through revolution and was beginning to live through industrialization, for something older and wilder and less organized than the world it found itself in. The Norse myths arrived into this hunger like cold water. They were translated, anthologized, reimagined. The Icelandic sagas were rendered into English, German, Danish, and Swedish. Scholars like Rasmus Rask and Jacob Grimm, yes, one of those Grimms, produced foundational work on Germanic philology and mythology that put the old stories on solid academic ground and simultaneously made them available to artists and writers who were looking for exactly this kind of material. The Valkyries arrived into Romantic consciousness with considerable force because they were everything the Romantic imagination prized. They were sublime. They were connected to nature, to storms, to the aurora, to the tremendous, indifferent landscape of the north. They were associated with death in ways that carried no Victorian squeamishness, that were in fact openly, almost ecstatically confrontational about mortality. And they were women of extraordinary power in a tradition that predated the categories the 19th century was still so anxiously constructing. Richard Wagner understood all of this with the instinct of a genius who was also, it must be said, a deeply problematic man. His Ring of the Nibelung, that 4-opera, 16-hour monument to Norse mythology, ambition, and orchestral excess, placed the Valkyries at the very center of its story. Brynhilde, whom Wagner called Brynhilde, became the emotional heart of the entire cycle. Her disobedience, her punishment, her sleep on the fire-ringed rock, her waking, her love, her grief, her final act of burning. Wagner understood that this was the story, that everything else in the cycle was context with his woman's choices and their consequences. The Ride of the Valkyries, that thundering orchestral passage that opens the 3rd act of Die Walküre, became one of the most recognized pieces of music in the world. It has been used in films, in advertisements, in political rhetoric, in comedy. It has been so thoroughly absorbed into popular culture that many people who have never heard of the Poetic Edda, who could not name a single Valkyrie, who have never once thought about the Norse concept of battle death, nonetheless hear those first bars and feel something large and forward-moving and slightly dangerous. That feeling has a name. It has had one for a very long time. It is the sound of women riding and the world getting out of the way. There is a question that sits quietly beneath everything we have covered so far, patient and persistent, waiting for the right moment to be asked directly. What did it actually feel like to believe this? Not to study it, not to translate it or analyze it or trace its literary genealogy across 1,000 years of manuscript tradition, but to genuinely believe in the way that a Norse farmer or a Viking warrior or a skaldic poet believed, with the full weight of a living cosmology pressing down on every waking hour, that the world was arranged the way the myths described it, that Odin was real, that Valhalla waited, that somewhere above the chaos of every significant battle, women in bright armor were making decisions about which of the dead deserved to be carried upward, and which did not? What did that belief do to a person? What did it do to a culture? The answer, when you sit with it long enough, turns out to be both more complicated and more human than the dramatic surface of the mythology might initially suggest. Begin with death, because in the Norse world, you cannot begin anywhere else. Death in the pre-Christian Norse imagination was not one thing. It was a landscape with different territories, different qualities, different implications for the person who arrived in each of them. There was hell. Not a place of punishment in the Christian sense, but a grey, quiet realm presided over by a goddess of the same name, where most of the dead went simply by virtue of having died of illness or old age, or the ordinary accidents of a hard life. It was not terrible. It was simply dim and still and permanent. There was Ran's Hall, at the bottom of the sea, where those who drowned were gathered by the goddess Ran in her net, an afterlife that carried its own strange dignity, cold and deep and salt-flavored. There were burial mounds where the dead might linger near their bones, present in a way that the living could occasionally access, as Sigrun accessed Helgi. And there was Valhalla. Valhalla was categorically different from all of these, and the difference was not merely one of comfort or prestige, though it was certainly both of those things. The mead that never ran out, the boar that was eaten each night and alive again each morning, the company of the greatest warriors who had ever lived. The difference was purpose. The warriors in Valhalla were not simply rewarded, they were needed. They trained each day for a war that had not yet come, but would come as certainly as winter, as certainly as the sun rising on Ragnarok. They were the reserve army of the cosmos, and their presence in Valhalla was not retirement but continuation, a different kind of service, elevated and preparatory, carried out in the grandest possible setting. To be chosen by a Valkyrie, then, was not simply to be told that your life had been well lived. It was to be conscripted into something larger than your life. It was to be recognized as significant enough, capable enough, worthy enough, to be needed at the end of everything. The choosing was an argument about your value, made by a being with perfect knowledge of the battlefield and complete access to Odin's judgment. And the argument was, you matter enough to keep. Understanding this transforms the entire emotional register of the Valkyrie mythology. She is not a figure of doom, she is a figure of selection. And the Norse warrior who understood himself to be operating within this cosmology went into battle, carrying a particular kind of knowledge. Not that he would survive, necessarily, because the myths are ruthlessly clear that survival is not the point and not always the outcome, but that how he conducted himself mattered in a way that transcended the immediate military result. The choosing was real. It was watching. And it was looking not for the winner, but for the worthy. This has a profound effect on how the Norse related to fear. Fear, in most human cultures, is the primary obstacle that warrior traditions have to negotiate. Every military culture in history has developed some mechanism for managing it. Rituals, drugs, religious conviction, unit cohesion, punishments for cowardice, rewards for valor. The Norse mechanisms were all of these things, but the Valkyrie mythology added something else, a metaphysical argument against the importance of the outcome. If the choosing was real, then dying well was not a consolation prize. It was, in the most literal cosmological sense, a victory. The warrior who stood his ground and died with the weapon in his hand had not lost. He had been selected. He had passed a test administered by beings who could not be bribed or fooled, who had seen every battlefield that had ever existed and would ever exist, and who had looked at him specifically and decided, this one. There is a word in the Norse tradition, nithð, that names the worst thing a person could be accused of. It is usually translated as cowardice or unmanliness, but the concept is broader and darker than either of those English words fully capture. To be nithð was not merely to be afraid, it was to fail the test. It was to conduct yourself in a way that made you, in the eyes of the choosing, unworthy of being carried upward. It was to ensure that when the riders came, they passed over you. The social shame of Neath was enormous, but beneath the social shame was a cosmological consequence, the permanent forfeit of significance, the grey quiet of an unremarkable death leading to an unremarkable afterlife. The Valkyries, in this sense, were not simply mythological figures. They were the operating system of a moral framework. They were the reason courage was not merely admirable but cosmically necessary. Their presence, believed, felt, assumed, made every battlefield a place where the stakes extended infinitely beyond the military question of who would control which territory when the fighting stopped. It is worth pausing here to consider the women in this equation, because the Norse relationship with the Valkyries was not exclusively a warrior's relationship, and it was not exclusively male. Women in the Norse world occupied a social position that was, particularly relative to many contemporaneous cultures, relatively substantial. They managed households and farms with genuine legal authority in their husband's absence. They could divorce, own property, and bear witness in legal proceedings, and they lived within the same cosmological framework as the men around them, which means they too moved through a world where supernatural women of extraordinary power were understood to be real and active and consequential. What did it mean for a Norse woman to understand the Valkyries as part of the structure of reality? The sources do not tell us directly, because the sources are almost entirely composed by men and concerned primarily with male experience. But we can reason carefully from what we do have. The Valkyries were the most powerful female figures in the Norse cosmos, outranking every human woman and most goddesses in terms of their direct influence over the outcomes that the culture valued most highly. They were not subordinate to men. They were subordinate to Odin, which was a different and much less diminishing arrangement. They served the highest authority in the 9 worlds, and in doing so they wielded that authority as its instrument. For a Norse woman watching her husband or son or father ride to war, the Valkyrie mythology offered something that no purely human framework could provide: the assurance that the outcome was not arbitrary, that if the worst happened, it happened for a reason that existed beyond the reach of bad luck or bad generalship, or the simple brutal mathematics of which side had more men. The choosing was real, and the chosen were chosen, not lost. Whether that was comforting in any ordinary sense of the word is a question each person who has ever lost someone to war would have to answer for themselves. But it was something. It was a structure placed around an experience that otherwise has no structure at all. The experience of waiting for someone to come home and learning that they will not. There is one more dimension of what the Valkyries meant that deserves its own careful attention, and it is perhaps the most intimate of all. In several of the legends, Valkyries appear not on battlefields but in dreams. They come to sleeping warriors and heroes the night before a significant engagement, not necessarily to warn them and not necessarily to comfort them, but simply to be present, to look at them. The dreaming warrior wakes with the sense of having been assessed, having been seen by something that knew him more completely than he knew himself. And the emotional texture of these dream visitations in the sources is consistent enough to suggest that they represented a genuine category of experience in the Norse world, something that people actually reported, that was taken seriously, that was understood as meaningful rather than dismissed as the noise of an anxious mind the night before a fight. To be visited by a Valkyrie in a dream was to be told, before the day had begun, that you were being watched, that the choosing was already in process, that whatever happened tomorrow, something was paying attention in a world without certainty. And the Norse world, like every human world, was profoundly without certainty, full of weather and disease and the unpredictable violence of neighbors and the endless, grinding difficulty of survival in a northern climate. That attention was not a small thing. to be seen, fully and without illusion, by something that cannot be deceived, to know that the measure of your life is being taken by a hand that does not shake. There is a reason this mythology lasted. There is a reason it crossed oceans and centuries, and the enormous cultural rupture of Christianization, and the even more enormous distance between a Viking age and our own. It is not because the Norse were uniquely credulous, or uniquely violent, or uniquely interested in death. It is because they found a way to say something true about what courage costs, and what it is worth, and what it might mean, in a universe too large and too old to care about any individual life, to be chosen anyway. All things that last do so by changing. It is perhaps the central paradox of cultural survival, that the only mythology, the only story, the only idea capable of crossing 1,000 years intact is one flexible enough to wear different clothes in every century it passes through. Rigidity does not preserve. It fossilizes. And fossils, however beautiful, are not alive. The Valkyries are still alive, not in the way they were alive in the mind of a Norse warrior standing in a muddy field in the 9th century, feeling the particular cold of a Scandinavian morning before a battle he might not survive. That specific, lived, cosmologically saturated belief is gone, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. The world that produced it, the 9 worlds, the world tree, the ravens, the slow grinding approach of Ragnarök, is not the world most people wake up inside of anymore. But something has persisted, something keeps persisting, and it is worth, in this final hour of our journey together, sitting quietly with what that something is. The 19th century, as we traced in an earlier segment, pulled the Valkyries back into wide cultural circulation through the twin engines of romantic nationalism and Wagner's operatic genius. But the 20th century did something different with them. It democratized them. It took figures that had previously required either scholarly access or an opera ticket and distributed them across the full breadth of popular culture, into comic books, into films, into novels, into video games, into the particular sprawling mythology of the Marvel Universe, where a character named Brunhilde appears as a hard-drinking, sharp-tongued warrior, played with magnificent irreverence by Tessa Thompson, armor traded for a scavenger's outfit, Asgard traded for a gladiatorial planet at the edge of the galaxy. But the essential quality, the woman who has seen too much death and carries it without apology, who chooses with a certainty that that is not a trivial observation. The fact that a figure from a 13th century Icelandic manuscript found her way, in recognizable form, into one of the highest-grossing film franchises in the history of cinema is a testament to something durable in the original image. The costume changes, the setting changes, the metaphysics change entirely, but the Valkyrie herself, the one who chooses, who carries authority no one granted her, and no one can fully take away, who moves through catastrophe with a calm that unsettles everyone around her. She remains. In the world of military tradition, the Valkyries left marks that are still visible and still in use. The word Valkyrie attached itself to military operations and aircraft throughout the 20th century with a frequency that was not accidental. The Convair B-58 Hustler's successor program was called the XB-70 Valkyrie, a supersonic strategic bomber of extraordinary speed and altitude capability, built on the logic that something moving fast enough and high enough becomes essentially untouchable. The name was chosen deliberately, and the choice reveals exactly what the Valkyrie had come to mean in the modern military imagination. Not the chooser of the slain in any theological sense, but the unreachable, the swift, the thing that passes over you and decides your fate before you are even aware it is present. Operation Valkyrie, meanwhile, was the name given to the July 1944 plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, a conspiracy involving senior Wehrmacht officers who understood, by that point in the war, that Germany was destroying itself and that the man directing the destruction had to be stopped. The plotters chose that name from an existing German military contingency plan, but the resonance was clearly felt. To invoke the Valkyrie in the context of an attempt to redirect the outcome of a catastrophic conflict, to position oneself as the agent of choosing rather than the subject of it, was not an innocent semantic coincidence. The name carried weight, and the people who used it knew it. In the broader culture, the Valkyrie has become something that functions almost as an archetype in the Jungian sense, a pattern so deeply embedded in the collective imagination that it operates below the level of conscious reference. You do not need to know her name to recognize her. She is the woman in the story who arrives after the violence, who moves through the wreckage with a purpose the survivors cannot yet articulate, who looks at what has been destroyed and makes a quiet, unarguable assessment of what was worth saving. She appears in literature, in film, in the particular way certain female characters are written, when the writer is reaching for something beyond the ordinary dramatic registers of strength or vulnerability, reaching for authority specifically, the kind that does not require permission and does not explain itself. She is still being written. She is being written right now, in stories that have never heard of the Poetic Edda and would not necessarily recognize the lineage. This is what deep mythological survival looks like. Not quotation, not homage, but the reappearance of a pattern in new material. The way a river's current shapes the same kinds of curves in whatever riverbed it happens to be moving through. And yet, for all of this, for all the operas and the aircraft and the comic books and the cultural echoes that ripple outwards still, there is something irreplaceable in the original, something that the modern versions, for all their vitality, cannot fully recover. Because the original Valkyrie existed within a complete cosmological system that gave her meaning in every direction simultaneously. She was not just a powerful female figure. She was the specific instrument of a specific god's specific plan for the survival of the cosmos through its final catastrophe. Every choice she made on every battlefield was connected, through Odin to Yggdrasil, to the Norns, to the slow approach of Ragnarok, to the question of whether anything at all would survive the end of everything. That density of meaning, the way the image ramified outward into every corner of the mythology it inhabited, is what the modern versions inevitably thin out. They keep the power and the beauty and the armor and the horses. They keep the woman who chooses. What they lose, more or less by necessity, is the weight of the world tree pressing down on every decision she makes. The Norse who believed in her did not have that luxury of likeness. She was real, and she was busy, and the stakes of her work were absolute. Every warrior who died well was a piece moved on a board whose final game was already scheduled. She was not a symbol. She was a function of the universe, as essential and as impersonal as gravity, and as intimate, when she turned her attention to you specifically, as a hand laid gently against the side of your face. We began this journey with a battlefield, and it is fitting to end there, not in the noise and chaos of the fighting, but in the moment after, when the ravens have settled and the smoke has gone horizontal in the wind and the living are beginning, slowly, to understand that they are still living in that silence. According to everyone who ever told these stories, something was departing. Something that had been present during the worst of it, that had watched with clear eyes and made its choices, was now riding upward through air too cold and too bright for human lungs, carrying what it had gathered toward a hall whose fires never went out. The Norse looked up at that moment, at the sky going dark at the edges, at whatever light still moved there, and they did not grieve exactly. They witnessed, because to have been present on a field where the choosing happened was to have been part of something that extended far beyond the battle, far beyond the century, far beyond the particular cold morning and the particular cause for which men had killed and died. It was to have stood at the place where the human world and the cosmic one came briefly, violently, luminously into contact. The Valkyries have been riding a long time. They are riding still,